change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
And the first thing that he brings to David in the cave is he brings his family. Because when David's family hear that David is in Adullam, they all come to him and they show their support for him. And you have to remember that David didn't always have the greatest relationship with his family. David's family wasn't always that supportive of him. Because you have to remember, David's dad, Jesse, he didn't think too much of him. And you remember, he didn't invite him to the feast that Samuel had. And you have to remember David's oldest brother, Eliab. He chewed David out to humiliate him before David went out and slew Goliath. But now they're all here. The whole family comes together and they support David. And so I kind of picture his mom bringing David his favorite cake or some kind of food that he likes, because they've all heard David had been mischaracterized by Saul. And they all know that it's not true, that David would have never done what he's being accused of, because they all know David. And there's another reason for David's family to all come down to David, because the Philistines now are overrunning Bethlehem at this time. And we find that out in 2 Samuel in chapter 23, that the Philistines, they now have a garrison in Bethlehem at this time. And it would only be a matter of time before Saul would come and try to hunt down David's family, which means that David's 3 brothers who were in the army, that they had to desert Saul's army. And so now they would all also be considered fugitives of Saul like David. And so as the word got out that David defected from Saul, we find out that there's a lot more men who weren't happy with Saul, who didn't want anything to do with him anymore. And David, he wasn't seeking anyone to join him. It's not like he's there sending out invitations. It's just that people just started showing up. And David here, he wasn't trying to build an army. He wasn't trying to go against Saul, because we never see David ever go against Saul to fight him in a battle. David never treats Saul like an enemy. He only treats Saul as God's anointed king, as his king. And these guys, they all just start showing up. And so maybe there'd be like 5 at a time or 10 at a time. And they're just gathering around David to get David to lead them. And if he was going to build an army, he wouldn't have picked any of these guys, because all of these guys, their lives were a mess. They were all broke and broken and disgruntled. And so here, where David's life is already a mess, and if you were David, you would rather have people coming that could actually solve your problems, not just more people with problems for you to take care of. But these are the men that God has called to come alongside David, these 400 desperate men, where David, he will begin to train these men and to form them into becoming David's mighty men, men of valor. But they didn't come that way. And that's the same thing God does to us when we come to Jesus. Because the way they came is the way that we come. Well, we come broke. We come distressed and discontented. And Jesus does for us what David did for them, where Jesus makes us useful, no matter what kind of condition we came to him in. And these are the kind of people who are always attracted to Jesus, the outcasts. These are the same kind of people that the disciples were, where nobody would have ever picked them. And the words used here about these people who came to David is people in distress. which means their lives were in no way together. These are people with major problems having no idea how to solve them. Because Saul was destroying the whole country, and David wasn't the only person Saul had been distressing. And these people, they're also in debt. And so you wonder if Saul had a hand in this by his overtaxation and by annexing all their properties, because now they're all mortgaged up the hilt. Because we see Saul distributing these kind of things to his cronies, who are all from the tribe of Benjamin, where he does these things to keep their loyalty. And then some of the men called to be with David are called discontented, where the Hebrew word actually means bitter in soul. And so these are those who are not satisfied with the way things are going with Saul or Saul's government and how it affected their lives. And these guys, they didn't even have the gas prices we have, and we're not even going to talk about the roads. So David, being down and out, he attracts all these other men who are down and out. And it's all because of David's character and his leadership. That's why they're attracted to him. Because he's the kind of king that they could serve. He's not like King Saul. And it's the same kind of people who were attracted to Jesus. It was the poor in spirit, the bankrupt, with nowhere to go, the bitter in soul, where Jesus' invitation was, "Come unto me, all who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest." And all these men, they came to David before he became popular. They all came when he was despised and mistreated by Israel. And so it's not right to think of this group as being a mob or as some kind of vigilante group, the kind of people who are trying to start a new government or a rival army. This is more like a team. This is a team who needs a leader, a captain, a man who can train them and take a bunch of misfits and turn them into mighty men of valor. And this group, they never fought against Saul, but they did learn how to fight the Lord's battles. And this wasn't the type of commitment that any of them could take lightly, because leaving the ranks of Saul and joining with David, it put a price on your head, because now they have made themselves an enemy of Saul. And if he caught you, it would be your life. And so David, he left Adullam and he went to Mizpah in Moab to take care of his mom and his dad, because they were too old to live the life of running around in the wilderness being chased by Saul. And Moab, it's on the other side of the Dead Sea. So David, he appealed to the king of Moab for refuge for his parents in Mizpah. And Mizpah means tower. And at this time, Moab would have been a safe place for his parents, because Moab was an enemy to Israel. So there was no risk of the king of Moab handing over David's parents over to Saul. And David's family, they would have still had family and relatives in Moab, because if you remember, David's great-grandmother was Ruth the Moabite. So now, after dropping his parents off to their sunny new retirement home in Moab, the prophet Gad, he tells David not to return to the stronghold at Adullam, but instead to go into the land of Judah. And David, he wouldn't have liked to have heard this, because the land of Judah was Saul's domain. But coming from Gad the prophet, that means that this was from the Lord. So David, he obeyed God's word and he went to the forest at Hereth. And then at verse 6, the whole scene changes from David to Saul's camp in Ramah. And so here we have Saul again, and he's sitting under a tree, but this time it's not a pomegranate tree, but it's a tamarisk tree. And so I don't think there's any fruity drinks this time. And Saul here, he's sitting around with his spear in his hand. And we really don't know if this scared anyone. We do know that if he got mad, he would throw it, but we've never ever seen him hit anything with his spear. And so now Saul, he's discovered where David and his men are hiding. And that's because it's hard to hide 400 men, and they're all back in Judah in Saul's domain. And Saul, he's filled with self-pity, and he's playing the victim. And all his men are having to sit there under this tree and listen to him because they've all been paid off by Saul for their loyalty. And the reason that Saul paid them off is because they're all family. They're all from Saul's same tribe. They're all from the tribe of Benjamin. And poor Saul here, he's whining to his war council that David wouldn't pay them off like he's paid them off because David's not a Benjamin, he's of Judah. And Saul, he confesses how he's paid them off with fields and vineyards, and he confesses how he paid them off with positions, making them captains and giving them titles. And so they're all on his payroll. And it's as if everything is all his. And really, the thing is, he took all these things from the other 11 tribes, the other people that he was supposed to be serving. And so Saul, he's trying to appeal to the lowest nature in these men. He's trying to appeal to their greed. And then Saul, he starts complaining about their lack of loyalty, even with all his bribes. So Saul, who began as his dad's lowly donkey boy, he has now become the tyrant king, and everything now he believes belongs to him. And here, he still can't even call David by his name. Saul is still calling David the son of Jesse. And David, he has a lot of great titles that he could be called from. He could be called his captain, his general. He'd be called the giant slayer, or even his son-in-law, or even just plain David. But Saul chooses the lowest title that he can think of, the son of Jesse. Jesse the farmer, the nobody. And Saul's men, they're having to listen to all this as Saul whines and he plays the victim. And nobody here feels sorry for Saul. And then he calls them all conspirators because they wouldn't tell Saul that Jonathan and David were friends, and that they made a covenant. And then Saul, he twists it all around, and he accuses Jonathan of stirring up David against Saul, which never happened. And then Saul says that David is lying in wait for him, which isn't true. Saul is lying in wait for David. But in Saul's mind, he has it all turned around, that he's the victim here, and he's constructing all these make-believe conspiracies against himself, that everyone is a conspirator. And nobody says anything back to Saul, because they don't see it the way Saul sees it. But Doeg, the bounty hunter, who's an Edomite, he says something back to Saul. And it's not because Doeg is sympathetic to Saul or that he's feeling sorry for him, but it's because Doeg is an opportunist, and he sees an opportunity for advancement, for self-promotion. And maybe he can even get some vengeance on Israel and on their God, because Doeg was probably a captive from Edom. He's probably an idolater who's pretending to be a convert. Because Doeg, he's the kind of guy who will do anything to get his boss's approval to be promoted. And he has no morals or any sense of right or wrong. And he'll act religious if that works for him, because we saw last week where Doeg, he was at the tabernacle in Nob. It's whatever works for him. But Doeg, he doesn't know God, and he has no fear of God. And what's really funny here is that his name, Doeg, actually means fearful, but he's not fearful of God at all. And so Doeg, he speaks up, and he tells King Saul, "It's not us that's conspiring against you, King Saul. It's the priests in Nob. And I saw the son of Jesse go to Nob." And Doeg is careful not to call David by his name. So he calls him the son of Jesse, just like Saul did. And then Doeg says that he went to Elimelech, the son of Ahitub. And Doeg talks about what we studied last week, that David saw Doeg, the Edomite, at the tabernacle in Nob. And Doeg, he starts here with a big fat lie. And you would think, wouldn't it be great if Liar's pants really did catch on fire? But these guys, they didn't wear pants, they wore robes. And so Doeg, he says his big line, he says, and he inquired of the Lord for him. But that never happened. Elimelech, he never inquired of the Lord for David. But the next part is true, because Elimelech did give him provisions, and he gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So Doeg, what he does here is he diverts Saul's suspicion of conspiracy from those who are present with Saul, from Saul's staff, to the priests at Nob. And Doeg is saying that it's the priests who are the real conspirators, and that they are David's real accomplices. And Nob, it's not very far away from where they are. It's only 3 miles from Ramah. So Saul, he drags all the priests from Nob over to him in Ramah. And they have no idea why they're there until Saul starts to accuse them. And Saul, he doesn't call Elimelech by his name either. He calls Elimelech the son of Ahitub. And this is what you call somebody if you're going to disgrace them. And these men, Saul and Elimelech, they've known each other for a long time, because Elimelech was with Saul and his army because he was the one that was seeking God for Saul way back when the Philistines way outnumbered Israel, when they had taken over Geba. But back then, Elimelech, he was called Ahijah. And so Elimelech, before King Saul, he says, "Here I am, my lord." And Saul, he goes off on him and he accuses him of conspiring with David by giving David bread and a sword. And then Saul repeats what Doeg said, and have inquired of God for him. And then Saul, he turns everything around again. And he says that Elimelech did this so that David should rise up against me to lie in wait as it is this day. Which again isn't true, because it's Saul who's lying in wait to kill David. David's not trying to kill anybody. And so you kind of have to picture Elimelech here, because he has to be stunned, because he's never heard of any of this before. He didn't even know that Saul had a problem with David. He only knows David as being good. And so Saul here, he is holding an illegal trial, which is all based on the rumor from Doeg. And before Elimelech ever defends himself, Elimelech, he defends David. And he tells Saul, he says, "David is a faithful servant of you, Saul." And it's the same thing that Jonathan said about David, that David is faithful. And David, he's your son-in-law. He's part of the royal family. And David does your bidding. He works for you. And he's the captain of your own bodyguard. And that's how it's written in the New International Version, that he was the captain of his bodyguard. And then he says, and that's all I know about David. And it's like, I would be in trouble if I didn't help him. And Elimelech, he denies that he ever inquired of God for David using the ephod. And then Elimelech says, "Let not the king impute anything to his servant or to any in the house of my father, for your servant knew nothing of all this, little or much." Meaning, I didn't do anything wrong. No one in my family did anything wrong. We didn't know anything about a conspiracy against you. And there's absolutely no evidence that Elimelech committed any capital crime. And by the law of Moses, he shouldn't be put to death. And even if Elimelech was guilty, it was illegal to punish the whole family for the father's crime. And Saul says, "You will surely die, Elimelech, you and all your father's house." And so Saul, he tells his guards to kill the priests. And in the King James Version, these guards are called footmen. And a footman would be Saul's bodyguards. So these would be the guys that would run beside his chariots. So these are specially trained men, the most loyal soldiers to Saul. And they refused, because this is cold-blooded murder. And these are God's priests. And so it's really good that they didn't obey him. but they also didn't do anything to stop it. And so Saul, he commanded Doeg the Edomite to turn and kill the priests. And as an Edomite, he had no problem killing priests because Doeg, he has no love for God. He has no respect for God's priests. And even though he was just at the tabernacle last week with Elimelech offering up sacrifices for him, because Doeg, he will act religious if he has to, if it will get him ahead. But Doeg, he is also willing to kill the priests of Nob if that will get him ahead. And here he sees this as an opportunity for his advancement. And so Doeg, he slays all the priests himself, one at a time, one right after another, slaying man after man for 85 priests. And it's kind of hard to believe that the people could stand by and watch this. And if that wasn't bad enough, after slaying the priests, Doeg went to Nob, and he slayed everyone else from the priests' families. Every man, every woman, every child, every nursing mother with their babies, and then every animal. And he utterly destroyed them. And if you look at what Saul did here with the priests of God, you realize that this is the very exact thing he was commanded by God to do against Amalek, Israel's enemy, that Saul refused to do. But Saul here, he has no problem utterly destroying the Lord's priest, the very ones who make atonement for the sins of the people, the actual men who represent God to the people. So Saul, he'll slay the anointed of God, but he will not slay God's enemies. And that's the same thing he's trying to do by killing David. He's trying to destroy God's anointed. So Saul, he's fallen as far as a man can fall, making himself an enemy of God. And so you can see here, Saul's anger, it isn't just against the priests or against David. His anger is against the Lord. And none of this was God's plan, but it is the fulfillment of a prophecy given to Eli about what would happen to Eli's house regarding the priesthood, of how it would be diminished and replaced by another branch of Aaron's family. And we'll see that his house will be replaced by the house of Zodok, and that'll happen in 1 Kings chapter 2 and in chapter 4. And the only man descended from Eli that lived that was able to escape this execution was Abiathar, the son of Elimelech, who will become the high priest, and he flees to David. And even though nobody would have ever held David accountable or responsible for the death of all these priests at Nob, David does. And he takes responsibility for his part, and it's because of his lies to Elimelech. And David, he does show his outrage for what Doeg did to the priests in a song that he wrote, because he wrote Psalm 52, which was written all about Doeg and his lies and the evil he committed. And David, he couldn't do anything now about the priests that were murdered, but he can do something for the one priest who survived. So David, he swears his loyalty and his protection to Abiathar. Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and Your Neighborhood Church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,